Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Jamie Herman, Manager of Adult Programming, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Princeton Public Library this evening and to introduce tonight's author event with Avram Alpert and Christy Wampole, who will be discussing his recently published book, The Good Enough Life. I want to start by thanking you all for joining us, both in person here in our community, and also hello to everybody joining us virtually on Crowdcast. We are so thrilled to have you here with us, whether in person or online. I also want to thank Labyrinth Books. They're at the back of the room with books to sign afterwards, and also the Princeton Humanities Council. They are our partners for this event. The library values working with community partners to provide programs such as this. And also thanks to Jody Price from Princeton University Press for all her assistance in arranging the details for tonight. Tonight's hybrid event will run for about 60 minutes in total, and there'll be an opportunity for audience members, both here in person and virtually, to ask questions. For those virtually, just pop them into the Ask a Question button, and we will try to catch them there. We have someone on the live stream monitoring the chat for questions, and just if you're here in person, raise your hand, and we'll bring you a microphone. The room is T-coiled enabled, so if you have a T-coil enabled device, please feel free to switch them on at this time. If you don't have a T-coiled enabled device but would like to use one of our headsets, let us know and I will bring you one. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the evening. Avram Alpert is a lecturer in the grading program at Princeton University and co-editor of Shifter magazine. His books include A Partial Enlightenment, What Modern Literature and Buddhism Can Teach Us About Living Well Without Perfection. His work has appeared in publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post. Christy Wampole is professor in the French and Italian department at Princeton University, and she'll be in conversation with Avram tonight. She is the author of The Other Serious, Essays for the New American Generation, Rudeness, The Ramifications of a Metaphor, and Realism, Novel and Nation in 21st Century France. Her opinion pieces and essays have been published in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the LA Review of Books, among many other places. And we are delighted to have both of you here with us this evening at the library, and I'm going to let you take it away, and I'll come back to moderate the question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thanks everybody for being here. We're so happy to see real humans in a real room. I think maybe I'll just start by asking you to tell us what your book's about. That's the best place to start, I think.
Thank you. Thank you all again so much for being here, and to the library and Labyrinth and the press for hosting, and Christy for agreeing to do this at the end of a semester when there are many things to do. So this book, I think the best way the way I've been explaining it is that there are two ways to respond to the fact that life is flawed, is imperfect, is inevitably full of some degree of suffering, of tragedy, of mistakes, of things beyond our control. It's only ever good enough. And I think one way that we can respond to that fact is to say, well, the most beneficial form of life is going to be one in which, as I say in the book, the kinks in our condition are best born through connections to our kindred. By kindred, I don't just mean family, but everyone around us, our natural world. And in a world where people are living well, are living decently, have the things that they need and the support that they need, we'll be able to kind of face these difficulties together. So I talk about it as both good enough in that sense of imperfect, but also good and enough. The good enough life is one that has goodness in it, right? It has decency, it has purpose, it has meaning, and it has enoughness. It has enough material goods that people can survive and thrive. And it combines the two, right? Because as human beings, we need emotional support. We need environmental support, right? We need goodness in all the things that we do. The other way of responding to this problem is to say, well, look, there are limited resources, and within these limited resources, we should really invest in the best of us. This is the President Eisgruber model of education, right? We should say that there is a certain number of people who deserve as much as we can give them, because if we support them, if we give them the best education, if we give them the most resources to pursue their dreams and their talents, it's going to eventually, probably not today, maybe not in 100 years, maybe not in 1,000 years, but eventually, right, it's really going to help all of us. This is the kind of promise of the competitive greatness model. If we support the best, they'll help us out in the long run.
It's a trickle down kind of situation.
Trickle down situation. Yeah, it's trickle down everything, not just economy, but right. Like if you give the best artists the time to make their work, if you give the best inventors the time to make their things, eventually, right, they'll solve climate change. They'll solve world hunger. They'll make all these great inventions for us. They may, it may not be so great for us in the meantime, but really, it's going to work out. And so I try to go into the book into some detail about why I think this greatness model doesn't work and causes more problems than it creates. But I started thinking about it in the same place where I found the origin of the term good enough. And that was in the work of Donald Winnicott, who was a psychoanalyst who worked mostly with relationships in the family. And Winnicott had this idea of the good enough mother, probably say the good enough parent today. And Winnicott, I think, saw quite clearly through the problem with the kind of greatness top-down model of things, although just talking about parenting again. And he said, when you're a great parent, right, what you want to do is give your child everything. It makes a lot of sense, right? You want to give your child, you want them not to feel pain, you want them not to suffer, you want them to have everything they need, so you try and do too much. Winnicott says, in this process, you damage yourself, right? You have too much anxiety, you have too much burnout, you're putting too much stress on yourself to be this great parent, and you're actually taking away from your child. You're not letting them learn from failure. You're not letting them kind of develop their capacities to be creative and to adapt. And so Winnicott said, look, you need to be a good enough parent, right? You need to be both good and enough. You need to provide all the support your child needs, and you need to be there for them, and you need to show them love, which can't be perfect, and you shouldn't be. And if you try to be, it's bad for you, it's bad for the child. And this was the kind of way I thought through greatness more broadly in the book. I said, well, what if we are doing that same kind of thing? We're misallocating our resources and our aims in all aspects of society. So I look at individuals, I look at relationships, I look at society more broadly, kind of political economy, and our relationship to nature, following through on what would a good enough life look like.
I was so glad that you invited me to be part of this event because I've been thinking about a lot of these questions also. And I think this moment of sort of this language of greatness, of course, peaked in maybe 2015, 2016 during the presidential election, the idea of Make America Great Again. And I remember thinking at the time, how can we be great if we can't even be good? It seems like goodness has to come first before you can move on to greatness. So I'm wondering about the origins of this book. Was it that discourse of greatness that kind of reared its head back in 2015, 2016? Is that what motivated you to write this? Is it the fact that we are in this very high-powered place here that really rewards this kind of social striving? What was it that inspired you to start writing?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a bit of everything. I think, some of it is life at Princeton, and I see a number of wonderful students here who I would often talk to about how stressed out and overwhelmed they were by their work. And it was certainly, I try in the book to downplay it a little bit, because I don't want it to be constrained by the kind of Make America Great Again moment. But certainly the word greatness, one title we had for the book was Against Greatness, like that this was really kind of the aim of the book, and we thought in the end, no, it's really for the good enough life. And greatness is just another mode of interpretation. And so I didn't want it to be totally constrained by the Trump moment, but certainly I think the word great was, for me and for many people, floating in my head as the kind of, there's something wrong with a world in which it is all about individual, like this kind of competitive system of greatness, and Make America Great Again, and who cares about the rest of the world? And as you see, day by day, right, that's not a very good model. As the writer Heather McGhee says, we live under the same sky. And so making our country do really well, but having pollution crossover or having climate crossover is not gonna work. But then there were other things, right? There was also, this wasn't just out there, this was personal, right? There were ways in which I think I had assumed, and I write about this a little bit in the book, that, I don't know, I would be like one of these great writers, or like I would be this kind of really special person, and isn't that wonderful? And it's not that it hasn't worked out, but it hasn't exactly worked out as I imagined. And I think that's a good thing, right? There was something that, and this is the kind of Winnicott model, I feel like instead of thinking, oh, I'm just going to be the next great writer or whatever, I realized actually there's so many wonderful and talented people, and there's so many wonderful people who don't have that many talents who get lost in our society. And I wanted to rethink from that point of view, what would it mean to develop a world that wasn't about being great, that was really about ordinary decency, what would a philosophical and moral vision look like around that? The only other little personal anecdote is that I tore some cartilage in my knee, and that's when I kind of really realized I was never going to be a great athlete. Like, it was just kind of all done from there, and I had to learn to live with that.
Yeah, that'll do it. An injury. I just wanted to say, when you were talking about the good enough parent, I remember years ago seeing a documentary. I think it was just called Babies, and it showed babies being raised in all these different places in the world. And there were obviously some parents who were hyper attentive, the kind of helicopter parents taking care of the baby, giving them. And then there were other parents. There was I don't remember which country it was, but the parents just basically propped the baby up against a goat all day long and just left it laying on this goat. And it turns out that this child turned out perfectly wonderful, and that you can leave your child laying next to a goat all day and it's going to be just fine. So, the good enough parent would perhaps, I don't know if being a neglectful parent would be the good enough parent, but that wasn't a question, that was just an anecdote. I wanted to say that every year at Princeton we have something called a Princeton pre-read, which is a book that everyone, the faculty and the students, read before we start. And this year it was Jennifer Morton's book, Moving Up Without Losing Your Way, The Ethical Costs of Upward Mobility, which I thought was a very interesting book to give to students in a place like this. So I'm wondering if you think that, one of the motivations for writing this book has to do with the kinds of social changes that have been brought about by things like more and more people going to college, a kind of raising of a standard of living, raising of a standard of what counts as a successful career. How much of the change, do you think there's something recent that's happened that has made this more of a problem than it might have been in, say, the 1950s? Or do you think this is just a perennial problem?
I wish I'd had that goat anecdote when I was writing the book. I really like that. And I do want to say, though, that it's not, I try also to chart in the book, it's not like about doing nothing, right? It is, this good enough is meant to be really, good and meaningful and sufficient. And if it turns out that the goat is a sufficient parent, then it's fine. But in terms of the time of it, it's an interesting question because a lot of the book traces, kind of long histories, and it goes kind of all over the place. Talks a little bit about evolutionary history, our origins as both kind of hierarchical chimps and more kind of cooperative bonobos, and how those both feed into who we are today. It goes through kind of various philosophical periods. I'm a little loose with my chronology. At the same time, I do think that there is something that has accelerated, especially in terms of thinking about our lives in terms of economic value. And it's not something that I feel like I can escape or just jump out of. I don't think it's personal. It's very hard to imagine living a kind of decent life if you don't have the means to support yourself. And the ways in which we can have the means to support ourselves, the kinds of jobs that I saw my parents have, who are here very kindly, working in public education or in as a rabbi, that these kinds of jobs, you may still get a decent job in your life and still not be able to afford to buy a house in the place where you live. Or you might kind of spend a lot of your time thinking, how am I going to retire because I don't have the kind of economic value that's required. And so as much as that, the kind of breaking of a social safety net that was established somewhat over a period of 30 years, as that cracked, I do think it put more pressure on us all to sort of, okay, well, how can I get out of that pressure? How can I kind of make enough money that I don't need to worry about these things? And I did see it a lot with students here. The ones here could probably say better than I could, but I would meet a lot of students who would say, I really care about inequality. I really detest the way that the world is organized. But if I'm going to make it in this society, I need to make at least $100,000 a year when I graduate, which I've never made that much. But right, this was the kind of expectation coming out of here, and that was almost like a need. This is what it feels like. So I do think that's accelerated, and I do think for a long time, this is a somewhat contested argument that the sociologist Max Weber makes, but he says historically, before the 18th century, wisdom and money-making were kept separate. There were always people who wanted to be rich, and there were always people who wanted to be wise, but they were not really combined. And he finds in Ben Franklin's sayings this moment when they start to be combined, right? So like a penny saved is a penny earned, or these kinds of, Franklin says somewhere in his autobiography, if you want to help a man in his life, make sure he knows how to keep his shaving kit in order, because that's also going to help him do the books later on. It's like these kind of things that are all about like these really quotidian things that'll help you make money later on. And so it wasn't that money hadn't mattered or power or fame hadn't mattered. It was just that this kind of collapsing, so that really like the growth of money and the growth of wealth became some kind of part of wisdom, some kind of financial wisdom. And I'm interested in a tradition that's trying to kind of keep those things a little bit separate. And what it would mean to be a good life is not being one that's entirely driven by these kinds of financial concerns. But it's really hard. When you can't just wish that to be the case. You can try to write a book about it and see where that goes, but you can't change the world that way.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking about in reading your book is that this idea of something mattering seemed to be sort of central. And I find that verb to matter a really interesting one, because it has this sort of idea of matter as material. If you look kind of deeper into the etymology, it has the same word root as like matrix or mother, and also wood, like in Spanish, madera. So this kind of a kind of materiality, so a thing that has some kind of substance, a substantive life, let's say. And of course, the idea of lives mattering sort of came to the fore even more with the Black Lives Matter movement. I wonder if you could maybe talk a little, I know that's just kind of a random question out of the blue, but the idea of deciding what matters. How does one decide what matters? How does one decide what should be a priority? Is that something that each individual has to define for themselves? Is there some kind of external measure by which we can, kind of metric by which we measure whether something matters or not? I'm just curious if you've thought about that word much, because it comes up quite a lot in your book.
Yeah, and that's some of that may be kind of catching the language of the times, and kind of appreciating what movements to insist that everyone's life matters. By saying Black Lives Matter in this way really was important, and I think probably caught on in the book in some way. But it was interesting because we did an event in New York the other night, and there was this young person in the audience who had just graduated from college. And she said, my whole life I've been told what matters. I've been told, like, you need to get this grade on your test, you need to get this score on your SAT, like, this is the kind of trajectory. And now that I'm leaving college, I don't know what matters anymore. And do you have any advice? Which is not a fair question. But I kind of did my best, and I was kind of looking around in the room, and one of the people in the room was this magazine Shifter that I edited for many years, and we used to do these public programs. And we did them twice a week for about 2 years, and then once a month for another 5 or 6 years, and they were just this huge part of my life. And I lost a lot of money doing them. We'd buy whiskey for everybody, like we'd go to the bar after, we'd buy people drinks. Like it was a complete, there was no value in it. And what mattered though, right, for me was that it was a community of people who came by every couple of weeks, and we talked to each other, and we hung out together, and we stayed friends, and we've like done other projects together. And there was just something about that really mattered to me. And it wasn't financial, and there was no real benefit career-wise. But it really was like this being around this community of people the past few months we've decided to wind it down. It's been kind of standing out to me as like a community of people that I can gather with and spend time with and share something with really matters to me. And I think that has to be something that, right, we all learn and experiment. And I wouldn't say like, okay, here are the, I think I'd be a better self-help book writer if I could like, these are the 6 things that matter in your life, and you should pursue each of them, and here's a chapter. But it's much more, I think, kind of finding that for yourself and going through those processes. And when I guess my only bit of kind of self-help advice, or what I offered to the student, was that if you let the kind of financialization be that only metric, it's not going to fulfill you on the other, I don't think. On the other hand, you can't ignore it, right, because you do have to eat. But if you let the kind of standard societal metric of how much money you make be what determines things, you're not gonna find meaning in that.
Is this a self-help book? I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about the format, because as I was reading, I work a lot on the essay form. To me, I felt like at moments there was something very essayistic about this. Other moments I felt more like I was reading philosophy. And then there are moments where it feels like self-help. So I was just, if you were to sort of, where would you put this book in Dorothea's bookstore or in the library here? In what section would you put the book?
Yeah, I've been kind of watching how it's categorized, and in some places it does seem to be in self-help, in some places philosophy, in some places like social policy. I don't, a little bit all over the place. And that was sort of, the idea with this book was that the first few chapters, more or less, if you appreciate this idea of slowing down, of finding meaning in life, of not having too much, but of having enough, regardless of what you think the politics that follow from that are, you could kind of go along with me. And then by the time you get to the 3rd chapter, I do have, pretty egalitarian philosophy of the economy that I put forward, and at that point I might lose some readers. But that's okay. But the idea was that like if you agree with this kind of modality up to this point, right, we could kind of go along and see how much we agree with about the politics or the economics that follow, and at least we could have a meaningful conversation about what differences we have. So I don't know, I think that self-help has it can have a kind of negative connotation as something a bit kind of light or unsubstantial, but I think it can also be really meaningful and important, right? Like we do have a lot of stresses, and there are books that I've read. I mean, I read a lot of Alan Watts when I was a teenager, and like it was really meaningful and helpful, and I think it calmed me down a little bit. And at the same time, right, I think that the self-help genre maybe doesn't always confront the difficulty of implementing some of its claims, right, to kind of slow down or appreciate our insecurities or our foibles when we have to deal with competitive social formations. And so what I wanted to do in the book was to try to link some of these kind of political questions to some of these kind of self-help questions. And I think, the difference between philosophy and self-help, I mean, I don't know what you think. Sometimes I think there's not much of a difference. Sometimes I think philosophy is just kind of like a fancy version of self-help. Sometimes I think one of the things that philosophers try to do is to pose questions like, what is a self? Right? What does it mean to help, in a way that a self-help book might not? But there is a fair amount of overlap.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, if I think of something like analytic philosophy, the difference is very clear. So then you think, oh, that just looks like math to me. But ethics, for example, I mean, I feel like a lot of the questions that you're broaching in your texts are ethical questions, really. And the question of how to lead a good life, how to be a good friend, how to be a good partner. You have these different sections in your book. You have at the beginning you say, why greatness is not good enough, and then your sections are, it's not good enough for ourselves, for our relationships, for our world, and for our planet. So you sort of grouped everything in those categories. I noticed throughout the book there's a lot of emphasis on kind of the tensions between the individual and the collective. So can one follow this good enough life model just as an individual, or is there some kind of imperative that the entire society change? If you want to lead the good enough life, is it possible in a society that's just striving for greatness?
Yeah, and one of the most confronting moments, I gave a talk about this book somewhat early on, and a black woman came up to me after and said, that sounds really nice. I like your good enough life philosophy. It sounds really kind of like chill and cool. But you have to understand, if you look like me and you wake up every day, you can't just be good. Like, you're not going to get anything. You're not going to get by. You can't just be good enough. And it stuck with me, and I really had to kind of think about what it was that I meant by good enough, and where it might be the case that because of social conditions, right, we can't, the recommendations, the kind of self-help recommendations are not going to meet the historical or political moment. And I try to register that in the book, and I bring her into the book. I think hopefully represent her accurately. But also, I did want to say that there are ways in which outside, someone who kind of grew up with, like me, like relatively, middle class suburban American, can look at other people's lives that weren't kind of as materially easy, and say like, oh, how unfortunate, how sad, how oppressed. But it's really, I think, that can also be very problematic when you're denying other people the meaningfulness, the good enoughness of their own lives. And one of the things I really wanted to get at in the book was looking at documents from people like Primo Levi, writing in being a concentration camp, or David Schroyer, writing about kind of the history of indigenous life in the United States, or Saidiya Hartman, writing about kind of black life in the 1920s and 30s, that there were ways to be good enough in times that were not good enough, right? There are ways to kind of find your meaning and your purpose and survive and thrive, even when all of this other stuff was happening. And so I wanted to strike some of that balance in the book to really recognize that people are not just victims, right? They have their meaningful and purposive lives, but also that it doesn't make our social order okay. Like, just, it's not just because people can manage doesn't mean that that's the way things should be. And so, yeah, when usually, I don't know what will happen in Q&A tonight, and maybe I shouldn't say anything about it now, but often what comes out is this kind of, well, I get what you're saying, but like, what do I do tomorrow? And it's a really hard question, because I don't have great answers, but I have my kind of suggestions and little things I think we can all do. But I think it is a really hard point, the balance between living in a more cooperative and socially meaningful way in a world that just doesn't fully encourage that.
One thing that I've noticed in reading is there's a lot of pathos in this book, and it's the pathos of someone who is trying. it seems like you're trying to apply the method that you're outlining here to your own life in real time. And that anxiety comes through right in the introduction, where you talk about, this idea of wanting to be a famous writer and then sort of trying to adjust that dream. And you also interrogate whether it's even possible to say we. At the beginning you say, it's a kind of commonplace in the essay to say we as a kind of invitational for your reader. But you say we, and then immediately you say, wait, can one even say we anymore? Is there a community to which we would refer universally? So I wonder if you could just talk about that, because I feel it's your personality that's in this book. You're trying to kind of, you want to be bold, but you don't want to say something that is not a kind of universal or something. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, writing a book is an anxiety-inducing kind of activity, especially when it's about dispensing advice about how to live. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about making yourself vulnerable in that way and trying to sort of imagine a community of readers that may or may not exist.
Yeah. I think one of the things I learned by teaching is that, you start out as a teacher wanting to have the answers. And then you realize what you're showing your students is that there's no learning happening, right? So you're not modeling actually the process of knowledge or learning. And I remember there's this moment I was teaching at Rutgers, and I told them this very personal story about my failed love life at the time. And it was amazing what that did in the classroom. It was just amazing how, everyone kind of opened up and everyone was kind of there and was like, oh, he's willing to be vulnerable and show us how he's learned. And then I think that kind of caught in the class. And the class was about Buddhism in the modern world, and a lot of it was about kind of stereotypes of Buddhism and how we misunderstand it. And I also told that, so I was like, look, I was kind of young. I read Alan Watts. I thought Buddhism had it figured all out, and it turns out it's much more complicated than that. And so I think that also let them kind of work through some of those myths and fantasies. And I tried to, and then, so the book I wrote before this, Partial Enlightenment, was the first kind of scholarly writing I had done that had personal stories in it. And it really came out of that classroom experience, realizing that it was just more interesting. The book is still, as we all do, right? We kind of write this literary criticism that is largely for academics, but occasionally there's stories. And so a lot of my friends who aren't academics who read the book said, I read all the stories about you. It was really fun. And I kind of liked, it was about 20 pages, and I got this little short story of your life. And I kind of thought, there is some, we identify, right? We maybe get kind of bored reading about Aristotle. Hopefully I try to make it kind of light, but maybe your mind kind of dips on the Aristotle pages, but then there's a little story or a joke or an anecdote, and it's a way to engage and kind of make that we. At the same time, I know, I don't, again, probably my personality, I think it's a good point. Fair comment, that I don't agree with myself a lot of the time. So I can't imagine that everybody agrees with me, right? I have on one page I'm thinking this, on another something else. And so I really wanted not to, when I sort of say we in the books, I do also mean different things by it. Sometimes I mean, hey, we're all trying to make the good enough life together. And sometimes I mean hey, we're all failing to make the good enough life. And it's these kind of different we's. And I also wanted to imagine an international audience. Because this book was written through these kind of intense years in U.S. American life, my international perspective was not that strong at the time. And I think a lot of this did kind of write through problems kind of specific here. And as I've talked to other people, and especially in China and Singapore, I've heard kind of interesting similar kind of feelings, anxiety over pressure, talking to someone in Canada the other day. And so I'm getting the sense that it's not, the we isn't too, it's not just, kind of overeducated people in the United States, but it maybe has some broader ramifications. And so I hope so, but I did want to just be honest about that and say, this is what I'm writing from and this is what I'm projecting to, and I hope it's interesting for you, and if my we isn't the one you write, I think I say in the book, feel free to tell me to shut up, but I'm going to risk it because I think it'll be more fun to read. And so some of it was just, the essayistic style. How do we make a book that people might want to read? Tell stories, make yourself vulnerable. So hopefully, it does come out. And there's that famous, in the essay tradition, right, Emerson says of Montaigne, right, cut these pages and the man bleeds. And I hope if you cut these pages, I laugh. There's not much violence here, but there's something of the personality.
I mean, I like what you said about, I mean, it's true of writing and of teaching, this kind of pedagogy of the personal, or pedagogy of vulnerability, that I think you're right that people tend to respond to that. If you were to have written this in a very clinical style, if you had never mentioned the I, that you had sort of eliminated your own subjectivity, I think it wouldn't have had the same impact. So I think you're right that that's the essayistic element, is that I can see sort of you working through a problem sort of in real time on the page. So I wanted to ask a little bit about, first of all, the book has a beautiful cover, and you should all buy this book. It's at the back of the room. I love the minimalism of it, but I wanted to ask you about the image that you use. As far as I know, it's this kintsugi method. When you break a bowl, is a kind of Japanese tradition that you put it back together, but you don't try to hide the fact that it was broken, that you make the shards and the sort of visible space between them, that it is its own kind of new cohesive whole. So I just am curious about, I mean, I think it's a perfect illustration of the content of the book, so maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
So the cover is by Carl Spurzheim, I think I'm saying that right. And so it's his choice. And I have to say, I gave the press a very hard time, in spite of my good enough mantra. I was like, that cover's not good enough, that cover's not good enough. But there's so many, and then this one came, and I even had some little doubts about this one. But you're right, and everyone has said it, and you're absolutely right. He did a really beautiful job, I think, of capturing, and it's such a nicely chosen image. And I don't, to be honest with you, know much about the ceramic method, but I think you described it perfectly. But I did when I kind of thought about it some more, and it's you kind of fill it in with this gold. And what I like about the kintsugi is it's not just the kind of capturing the letting the cracks show, but showing how the cracks are also beautiful. Right, there is something kind of, it's not just the negative part of it, and the idea that, I mean, I have in my mind a book that came out kind of as I was writing this by Paul Bloom, the psychologist, called The Sweet Spot. And a lot of the argument that he's making in the book, which I didn't have time to really incorporate, was that we find happiness not actually just in things that are nice. If you think about raising a child, not that I'm raising them, but that I was raised by people, it's probably hard a lot of the time. There's a lot of difficulty that goes into that, but that's what makes it enjoyable. That's what makes it pleasant. You go mountain climbing, or you write a book that I mean, this one hopefully people read, but I've written academic books that I'm assuming will just gather dust for years to come. But there's something in the travail and the trial and the difficulty and the that's it. That's what it is, and it's broken, and that's fine. And there is some, So what the kintsugi does, I think, is to draw out the beauty in that, that this is actually like a lovely object that preserves its cracks and says, yes, this is actually how something wonderful gets made.
I have a few more questions to ask, but I wanted to just ask everybody to start kind of queuing up in your brain questions you might have. I wanted to ask you, there's one point in the book where you talk about, you sort of say, it's not that you're against greatness, and you give the example of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., and you say, it might sound like you're sort of against any kind of people that would rise to the top, that have some kind of natural talent or that have some kind of charisma. You push back and say, no, that's absolutely not what I'm saying. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that sort of the kind of greatness that fits in your model, and the kind of greatness that we might see as sort of, a kind of harmful greatness.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's really a kind of complicated balance, because it's true that if you read the history of social movements, right, you read the history of the Indian independence movement or the civil rights movement in the United States, there is a lot of tension around the kind of great leader model. One, because so much of the work in these movements is not done by the great leader, right? It's done by ordinary people going door to door, organizing, developing contacts, and deepening things. And also because, right, when you're dependent on the leader, when the leader goes, and in both these cases, right, gets assassinated, it damages the movement in a kind of profound way. And so there's interesting histories to be told about, right, what it would mean to try to have a movement that grows somewhat, really stays with the kind of bottom up and grassroots. On the other hand, without the charismatic leader, right, you don't have the media attention, you don't have the kind of legacies. And so there's these tensions in the movements around those kinds of things. And I think one of the really difficult emails that I got after writing a little bit about the book prior was from a community organizer who said to me, look, I work with these people, and they get up every day at 6 a.m., they take their kids to school, they work 9 to 5, and then at night they don't go home. They come to the community meeting to try to make where they live a better place. And you want me to say, like, hey, you're good enough. Like, can I call these people great? And I really want to say, like, of course we can call. Like, these are great. This is a great thing to do. This is amazing. I think one of the people who blurbed the book, I think because he's a kind of cheeky guy, was like, this is a great book. And, that's fine. It's a nice thing to say about someone. These are great parents. Like, he's my great uncle and aunt. Like, these are great students. I'm happy for all of this. But at the end of the day, what I don't want to have happen is to think that greatness as the system in which we're kind of competitively trying to prove why we're so special, why we're so deserving, in this hierarchical way that inevitably excludes so many people. Like, that is really the kind of target of the book. And so I think even people like King or Gandhi or the community organizer who wrote me and the neighbors that he worked with. Their goal is to have a world that is like good enough in the sense, right? It's still flawed, it's not perfect, but everyone has what they need and they have meaning and they have purpose. And so it's, they may kind of have to put in a little extra effort. We all might have to in dark times or in difficult times. But the end game has to remain kind of focused on the good enough ideal.
I'm wondering, do you think there are people who are just bad people? Just people who are just bad, and there's no hope for them to become good enough?
I mean, there may be someone who, like, in the instant of their death has no reformable capacity, and, like, that person maybe is bad. But other than that, no, I think, like, the fundamental thing about humanity is that we change. And, we change over time, and the ability to reform and the capacity to reform is so important. So I think there are people who are probably spend a lot of their time and energy doing really cruel and mean things. But I don't think there's something that makes them, like, essentially or inherently or inevitably bad. I would sort of say, like, there's the possibility to reform. And for me, the best TV show, really, but the best example of this that I can think of is The Good Place. And it's hard to describe if you haven't seen it because there's lots of twists. But I think it perfectly kind of condenses this idea that even someone who, in spite of what I said earlier, it does take place in the afterlife, and someone dies, and then they realize that the problem isn't just like what this person did in their lives, is that the system was designed in such a way to judge them good or bad. And what should have been done was we should have had a system that was figuring out how do we get everyone to be good? Like, what is a world that works in such a way that we can all kind of improve ourselves? This takes place in the afterlife, so they have more time to work this all out. It's a little more complicated on Earth. But I hope that we could have a world like that, right, and don't have to wait until the afterlife.
Just one more question, and then I'll open up the Q&A. I'm wondering about social media, because I think social media, of course, has created this condition in which you sort of measure your life by other people's accomplishments. And I was watching, I was just glued to the TV when Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, was testifying about what Instagram does to young women who just are looking at pictures of other young women and trying to sort of force their bodies to match those ideals. How big of a role do you think social media and other, these tools that force us to compare ourselves to other people, do you think that plays a big role in our sort of struggle or striving for greatness?
Yeah, and there's I'm not remembering his full name, but there's a philosopher of games, last name is Nguyen, and he's written this really interesting essay, and one of the things he talks about in it is that if you're a teacher in a classroom and there's like 10 students in the classroom and 9 of them are falling asleep, but one of them looks like you've just said the most exciting thing ever, right? As a teacher, you're like, those 9, whatever, I'm sorry, but hey, I reached somebody, right? And if you're like me and you try occasionally to say something on Twitter, and like, if I get like 2 likes, it's like, yes. But that's not what Twitter feels like. Twitter feels terrible if you only get 2 likes. You're meant to get hundreds or thousands, or whereas the point that he makes, I think, really nicely is in the classroom, right? If you get if you get 2 students to like be really excited, that's amazing. And like that kind of good enough feeling of, okay, I've reached some people today. Obviously, I'm not going to speak to the whole audience or to the whole class, but I've reached somebody. Things like that become increasingly difficult on the online world. And I mean, the kinds of, I'm not an expert in any way in the problems of social media, but I think we've all seen kind of what goes wrong. And there are certainly ways in which there is inequality in social media as well, especially around things like attention and interest, right? So I think, actually a student, I don't think he's here, but wrote a paper for me one semester on this once, which was quite interesting, on how, I can't remember the numbers, but it almost mirrors the economy. Like 1% of Instagram users, 1% get 99% of the likes and the followers. I mean, it's almost the same as a kind of 1%, 99. And there is some way in which, right, just as like anything else, you're trying, how do you get to be in that 1%? How do you get to kind of be part of that? And so I think it's certainly reduplicating at that level. And then what it's doing to politics, to body image, to our kind of understanding of our neighbors and our social world is problematic. On the other hand, there are good things about social media, and occasionally, like, you get nice notes, and you do get that one like, and I try to embrace, like, yes, okay, I got one, I reached somebody.
You're an idealist at your core, I can tell. But it's true that, social media, it's just a machine for making people feel bad about themselves, I think. Mostly. It does other things. It does positive things. So I guess now, can we open up the floor for questions? I think, should I hand people a mic, or do you have?
I have that.
Okay.
Yeah,
so I think we're also taking questions from people in the audience online. So
so we do have, and we've had some chat going on in the online audience, which is interesting. The commenting is about sometimes they think people, coming from Patty, sometimes I think the more personal something is, the more universal it is. And then someone agreeing and then saying, and then she replies and says, and yet people are terrified to show their deepest vulnerabilities for fear of judgment and how that impacts life. And we've also had Jackie online who's thanking you for the cover choice involving pottery and also for using a hyphen. So thank you for those comments online. Yes, so is there anybody in the audience here? I can run the microphone over. And just a moment.
Thank you very much. It's been really great to listen to your thoughts. I have a question about the condition under which we think about the good enough life. I heard a lot of stories of like trials and tribulations, difficult times, darkness. But I guess I can't help but think what happens when people are doing fairly well. What happens in conditions of affluence or when people are able to achieve their well-being. How does that affect the equation? Thank you.
Thanks. I think it probably varies for different people in different ways, but I think some of that is going to be setting limits on your own well-being, right? Sort of saying, like, I don't know if this question is like the whole world's doing really well, and then what happens, or if it's kind of like this community is doing really well. So if it's this kind of slice of the world that's doing much better than everywhere else. I think the problem that I have, and I try to talk a little bit about in the chapter that deals with politics and society, is that, right, in an interconnected world, one area kind of doing well is inevitably going to be shaken over time, right? So you're going to have a refugee crisis, you're going to have an immigrant crisis, like you're going to have a climate change crisis, like you're going to be having to deal with problems that are happening in other places. And so kind of just saying, well, we're doing okay, so there's not too much to worry about. If you're asking my kind of like utopian question, like, okay, we live in this good enough world, like 2 or 3 days from now, or whatever, far into the future, and what does that kind of look like? And I think that, this is really dynamic and exciting for me. Like, the point of this book is not like, okay, we've reached the point in human history at which we no longer need progress and we like have enough stuff and like it's all over. It's actually that I think, we live in literally there are 3 billion odd people, right, who live with less than $5.50 a day, like in a world that has $400 trillion in combined wealth. You can't just translate that exactly, but it's pretty insane, right? And so I'm just trying to imagine a world in which more people are more meaningfully integrated into like these possibilities and opportunities and ways of thinking and engaging with others. And in so doing, that we're all like living out this kind of Keynesian dream where we're working like 15 hours a day, 15 hours a week. 15 hours a day is the present, right? We're just not doing that much, but like because everyone's involved and because everyone has received this kind of education and care and support, there's so much more kind of like growth. I don't know. So yeah, this is my kind of utopian dream. We still have like, I don't know, tragedies. Sometimes the person that you love is going to love somebody else. Like we can't do anything about unrequited love. And any solutions we come up with, I'm just thinking like we could clone people, but that's a bad idea. Like anything you do, right? There's still going to be natural disasters. There's still going to be death, right? There's going to be some part of human life that is bound up with failure or mistake or accident or what have you. And I think that it's just kind of saying, okay, that is an irremovable amount of kind of suffering or difficulty, and we can work on that together. And when things go wrong, we can deal with that together. But there is suffering in the world that can be removed. We don't necessarily know how. We don't necessarily have the institutions or the organizations, but that's kind of the good enough dream to deal with the removable suffering and deal together with what can be.
Okay, we have a question from online. Do you think the Great Resignation is a symptom of people looking for the good enough life? And I guess the Great Resignation is, of course, people who are just walking away from jobs because they're like, we're not going to take it anymore, I guess.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and I tried to write like I was like, this is a good enough life op-ed, and I tried to think about the Great Resignation in these terms, and I wasn't sure. I just haven't studied the phenomenon enough, and I'm not sure how long lasting it is. I'm not sure what the numbers are going to show in a few months or a few years, but I think some of it is just bound up with care and concern and the problems around the pandemic. I imagine that there is a slice of this, though, that is very much what this person is saying, which is people sort of saying, I'm able to survive or live well enough doing something that doesn't stress me out, that doesn't pull me out of my life, that doesn't kind of sever me from my community. I found a way to kind of make enough money that I can, get by, but I can do these other things that I care about more. And I like to think that that's a component of the Great Resignation. I haven't looked into it enough to say more deeply.
Okay, and I'll go back to the audience in one moment, in live audience, but this is a really good detailed question from the virtual community, saying, thank you for the discussion of a text that can only accurately be characterized as truly great. The conversation briefly touched on the question of organizing, i.e. whether we can think of certain organizers as great, and I'd like to hear you talk a bit more about how these concepts operate in the context of political organizing. How, for example, do we sketch or evaluate the contours of a good enough model in terms of political organizing?
Great, thanks. Thanks for that question. And as that was coming in, I feel like I missed something that you said. I can't remember, something about kind of vulnerability and universality, and I can't remember, so I apologize to that person if we missed their question. One of the, so I think one of the problems that you get in organizations that I've learned by reading these histories and occasionally participating in organizations is like a charismatic leader who holds everything together and then retires or goes away or starts another project. Like Saul Alinsky, the kind of one of the key figures in community organizing in the 20th century, would get bored, right? So he'd kind of come and he'd be really charismatic and he'd get the group together and then he'd be like, okay, you guys keep going, I'm going to go to Buffalo now or Rochester or Kansas City. And so there are these problems that occur when we have too much embedded in a particular figure. In the book, I talk about it a little bit with Adrienne Marie Brown, who's an organizer and a blogger, prolific writer. And one of the things that she talks about that I found quite interesting is she has this kind of idea about the V formation that geese take when they fly. And according to her, and I take her word for it because I don't know, but geese kind of rotate in and out of the point of the V, right? So someone will, some goose will be in the leadership position for a bit, and then someone else will take over. I keep saying that. Some other goose will take over. And the reason being that is the hardest position, right, to kind of lead the group. And maybe not every goose does this, but which goose ever would like to is kind of able to and take their part. And I like that, so she sort of says, this should be our leadership structure in our social organizations. We can have leaders, it's important. Sometimes you just need a decision maker. Like sometimes consensus isn't really working and you just need someone to kind of say yes, but that person should be accountable to everyone else and shouldn't be the only person vested with that power, right? We can kind of keep moving and keep rotating and bring more people in and have this kind of other structure of decision making. And again, it's not going to be perfect, right? You're still going to have fights and arguments and all these sorts of things, but it would bring more people in. And also, I think the point that she makes is it's not great for a movement to say, hey, come join our movement and burn out by being our next leader. Which is an essay she's writing about, burnout, and she's basically saying there's too much that's vested in like, I'm going to do everything I can to like lead this group or win this fight. And eventually what happens is you burn out if you don't, like Alinsky, get kind of bored. And so the idea here is also it would kind of bring more people in, let more people be part of the structure, and keep more people from kind of wanting to say, hey, I worked at this organization for a couple of weeks and I haven't seen my kids and I don't want to do this anymore, right? Kind of bringing more people along.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question, and we have somebody here with their hand up. Here you go.
Oh, my mask on. Two thoughts. One, how do you reconcile the concept that greatness, the definition of greatness seems to change over time? So, our parents' generation was the end of the greatest generation. And, what my definition of great is maybe completely different than what your, as I know, it's completely different than what your definition is. And then just really quickly on the organizing concept, because organizing ties to politics, and the theory of politics is compromise, in theory, and so compromise should be, the achieved result should be a good enough result if it involved compromise. Your thoughts?
I think, one, I don't know if Michael's still here, but Michael read the manuscript as my research assistant, and he said, like, I get what you're up to, but can't we just call this great? Like, isn't all the things you're describing as a good enough word? Like, isn't that just, we can say, like, great is, like, doing nice things for people and, like, not being a jerk all the time, and trying to be part of your community. Like, why don't we just say that? And I take that, like, I'm using the word greatness in a very kind of specific sense. The reason, besides the fact that I am a stubborn human being, like I insisted on the good enough as a model, is that it's hard for me to see how in the word great we can contain the meaning of imperfection. Right? We can kind of really have that sense of the good enough as this, we are responding to problems and we're figuring out how to have that still be, it's only good enough, but it has to be good enough. And try to get that balance. And greatness, I just couldn't kind of get into that logic. And there's also some, I go a little bit into the history of the word, especially as it's used, right, like by poets and philosophers. So John Milton will talk about how, Jesus is not great but good, right? This idea that he's not special, he's not powerful, he's just moral, right? And this was kind of what made him this kind of special figure in Milton's epic. Or Adam Smith, who I think is my kind of like frenemy in this book, because Smith was really a critic of greatness. Like he constantly says the thing that corrupts us is people wanting to be rich and powerful. And what we really should have is be moral and be good and be decent and care about others. And he just can't quite, he kind of says in our human psychology, the thing is we really want to be loved. And when we look around the world, we see who is loved? Well, it's the rich and the powerful. So we want to be rich and powerful. And he can't really figure a way out of that. So he says, well, it's okay, just get rich and powerful, but then, let it trickle down in the end. And I think we can do a little better than that. So there was like kind of precise moments where the word greatness mattered to me. In terms of compromise, it just depends. Compromise is a complicated word, right? Like it's in its kind of origin, right? Meaning something you're kind of working with somebody or you're kind of finding some kind of meaningful middle ground. But if I say to you, I don't know, like your money or your life, right? There's not a meaningful compromise between my position and yours, right? So we have to kind of make sure that we are having these significantly meaningful stakes on either side. And if one side is saying, climate change isn't real or whatever, there's not much meaningful compromise to be made. And so I've been thinking about kind of writing a piece like why moderates aren't good enough. Not in the sense that I have anything against like moderation or position, but that good enoughness, like as in this has to be good and it has to provide enough and it can't be perfect and it's going to be flawed, but it doesn't just mean we're kind of in the middle of two given positions. So that's the best I can do for now.
Okay, so I want to thank you so much for this conversation. It has been wonderful. And the audience for coming out tonight. We do have Labyrinth books here at the back, and the author is willing to sign your copies for you. And so thank you again, and thank you to our live stream audience for participating. And stay tuned for more great author events, both here at the library and at Labyrinth. We like to partner together all the time. And I know we have some coming up next week, so check our websites and see what other author events you might want to attend. Thank you again.